It was a crime made possible by war, forgotten, suppressed, and concealed.
In total, about 13 million people were brought to the Greater German Reich.
The truth is that slave labor in Nazi Germany was a very central part of what was going on in this period.
The Vernichtung durch Arbeit is a German idea. The idea was, let's squeeze them like a lemon.
It happened under everyone's noses.
More than a quarter of all workers were forced laborers.
Summer 1941. In Germany's factories and on the farms, there was a shortage of 3 million workers, most of them young men. They'd been sent to fight in the war against the Soviet Union. From the start, Operation Barbarossa was a war of exploitation and destruction. In the eyes of the Nazis, the Soviet population and Soviet prisoners of war were Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans, whose lives were worth nothing. At first, the Nazis had no plans to use them for forced labor.
Die Gefangenen aus den Durchbruchs- und Umfassungsschlachten in der Ukraine werden in großen Lagern gesammelt. Diese stumpfsinnigen Horden aus den Steppen Innerasiens werden heute von der englischen Plutokratenklicke als Verteidiger der europäischen Kultur und Zivilisation gefeiert.
You know, there is not much that I have seen in my lifetime that has made such a terrible impression on me as the German Wochenschau newsreel reports on their victories in the first weeks of the war. They showed the huge columns of prisoners of war, and we knew exactly what fate awaited them.
More than 5.7 million Soviet prisoners of war were held in German custody. 3.5 million died. Most of them in the camps that were set up in the occupied territories.
Mass murder, all but forgotten. In just the first 6 months of the campaign, over 2 million Soviet soldiers died in German captivity.
And it's terribly sad. The sufferings of the Soviet prisoners of war haven't been taken into account nearly enough in our culture of remembrance in Germany.
Millions of people in the freshly conquered territories now faced the same deadly racism the Nazis had practiced in Germany for some time. The Sinti and Roma people were among its victims.
They were seen as being unworthy of life. They were excluded from society. They faced discrimination. Many of their civil rights were taken away, and they were deprived of German citizenship.
Otto Rosenberg. He was still a child when the Nazi authorities in Berlin rounded up the city's Sinti and Roma and locked them up in a so-called Chipsi camp. At 13, he was forced to work in the armaments industry. At 16, he was deported to Auschwitz.
In Auschwitz, even the children were put to work paving the camp roads. They were made to do everything there, any task that was given to them. And the work was hard labor. Anyone who couldn't work, who wasn't fit enough, faced certain death. My father said, the people were made to work until they had no more strength left.
In the Gypsy camp in Auschwitz, Otto Rosenberg was together with his grandmother and other relatives. Unlike other categories of victims, the Sinti and Roma were not separated from their families.
Family members were made to suffer in front of their relatives. This was done systematically, and that's the worst thing about it. I can imagine when you're already suffering yourself, how hard it is to have to watch your family being destroyed, being beaten. It's terrible.
The average life expectancy for forced laborers like Otto Rosenberg in Auschwitz was just a few months. For a while, it looked as though the Red Army would quickly be defeated. But German losses were high. The Eastern Front needed more and more soldiers.
It's clear that labor is an issue from early on, because as you draft men, again, you need to replace them in the factories and other places they've been working.
The lives of Soviet prisoners of war were worth nothing until the beginning of 1942.
And then the mines in the Ruhr region sent reports saying, "We don't have any more workers, we can't extract any more of the coal we need to produce steel to forge German weapons. We need the Soviet prisoners of war." It was only then that the highest authorities in the German Reich approved the use of Soviet prisoners of war, first to work in the mines and then in many other areas of the economy.
For the Nazis, this was an ideological problem. The so-called subhumans from the East were not supposed to enter the Reich, but the shortage of manpower meant that compromises were necessary. Hundreds of thousands of people were brought into Germany and systematically distributed to interested employers.
First, they were taken to transit camps where the staff of the labor administration registered them. Their health was examined, and of course their names, professions, and so on were noted, as were their professional skills, and then a check was made as to which company had applied for which categories of forced laborers.
It was like a slave market. As here in Stuttgart, the Wehrmacht distributed new forced laborers throughout the Reich. Plenty of workers were available. They were cheap, they had no rights, and they enabled the German economy to maintain war production. After the war, many companies claimed they'd been obliged to use forced laborers against their will.
In fact, we have not one single shred of evidence that any German company, German farmer or German private household was ordered against their will to employ forced laborers by the National Socialist Labor Administration. Quite the opposite. The companies were clamoring to make use of the forced laborers.
It was extremely profitable for the German economy. At a colliery in the Ruhr region, a German worker received almost 9 Reichsmark a day. Depending on where they came from and their status, forced laborers cost just a fraction of this amount. Civilian workers from the West and from Poland received far less, while the Ostarbeiter, or Eastern workers from the Soviet Union, and Western prisoners of war earned very little. Soviet prisoners of war received practically nothing, and concentration camp prisoners nothing at all. For each laborer, the employers paid between 4 and 6 Reichsmark a day, direct to the SS.
The SS is given control of concentration camps, and then the SS also becomes a very important economic player, and they understand that the camps could be a source of making a lot of money for them. And then it really turns into labor camps. Concentration camps basically become labor camps, almost all of them.
The dream of a quick victory came to an abrupt end in the winter of 1941 to 42. The National Socialist regime was forced to restructure the economy for a longer war. The Gauleiter of Thuringia, Fritz Saukel. He organized the procurement of forced laborers from the occupied territories. By the end of the war, he was responsible for the compulsory displacement of 7.5 million people.
By 1942, when Fritz Sackel is put in charge of labor, and when the armaments ministry will come under Albert Speer as well, there's an attempt to make them more efficient from their point of view, at least an idea that they have to be more efficient, because they say if we don't do it, we can't win the war. So we need to use labor more effectively.
One person who was grateful for these laborers was Albert Speer. In 1942, he became armaments minister and head of the TOT organization, responsible for major engineering projects. Both would benefit from the new slave workers from the East. A plan that had largely failed in Poland and Western Europe was now to be tried again in the East, recruiting people to come and work in Germany without the use of force. The promise was that those who volunteered would no longer go hungry.
The voluntary nature of this recruitment went hand in hand with a selective policy of starvation in the occupied territories. Tens of thousands of people went hungry, and the prospect of working in Germany and getting better rations, even of being able to send food home to relatives, meant that some people registered voluntarily. But from the moment they were put on the trains and deported to the Reich, where they were taken to camps or sent to their place of work, they gave up their freedom entirely. They couldn't say, "No, I want to go back."
For the people in the conquered Soviet territories, the tyranny of Stalinism was now followed by the murderous rule of the Nazis. Zinaida Bashlai from Russia lived with her parents and 2 siblings close to the Ukrainian border.
I was born in Belgorod in 1914. My parents came from the Sumy area. My father had a lot of small animals, geese, chickens, turkeys. He liked keeping poultry and enjoyed looking after the birds. All that disappeared in the first few days. The Germans seized all the animals, wrung their necks and took everything away to eat.
The Germans plundered and murdered, yet most people preferred to stay rather than be persuaded to go and work in Germany. When the Germans came, Zinaida Bashlai was 27 years old.
And then they started to take us to Germany, mainly women. There were only a few men. Either they were away fighting or they were small boys, not yet grown up.
Now pressure turns into violence and roundups, chasing people out of cowsheds and marching them at, practically at gunpoint to the lorries and threatening their families if their families try and stop them. The scenes are pretty indescribable. There's a real fear and dread of these deportations setting in, certainly by spring, summer of 1942.
They were transported in cattle wagons. They weren't allowed to get out at the stops, and there was hardly anything to eat. The whole way in which this deportation was conducted was really terrible. The disinfections conducted in Poland were similar to those in the concentration camps. Everyone can still remember those.
The practice of forcible recruitment in Poland was then extended to Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Initially, it applied mainly to young women.
Quite frequently, they had to strip to be medically examined. This was an extraordinary shock and humiliation, especially for young women. I'm sure it was for young men too, but I think for young women particularly.
For us, the worst part was not having any contact with home. One girl who lived with us in the camp went mad. She lived in our barracks, in our room, and the girls began to notice some strange things about her behavior, this Genia. And finally, the Germans took her to a mental institution.
Although the Germans urgently needed anyone who could work, the forced laborers from the East usually faced brutality and malnutrition.
Certainly, I think in 1942, when the regime was at its zenith, and for Sauckel, it seemed that the sky was the limit, that there would be endless supplies of workers coming, that you didn't have to look after them particularly.
The National Socialist forced labor system reached unimagined proportions. Within just 1 year, more than 1.3 million people had been forcibly taken to Germany from the Soviet Union. Over 4.5 million foreign laborers were now working in the Reich, most of them from Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The National Socialist regime issued extremely precise instructions as to how the German population should treat the forced laborers from the Soviet Union. On February the 20th, 1942, the Eastern Worker Decrees were published. The Nazis had them working side by side with Germans to a degree, but outside the workplace they were strictly segregated. Soviet forced laborers wore an identifying badge and were not permitted to leave their place of work. German managers could punish the Eastern workers. They were housed separately and given a lower wage and lower quality food than Germans. In most cases, they could only spend their wages inside the camp. They could own no valuables and were forbidden from mixing with Germans. All sexual contact with Germans was punishable by death.
In short, the laws and regulations set out by the National Socialists in relation to the guest workers meant that they were entirely dependent, and they became slaves.
From the perspective of Nazi ideology, the lives of Soviet citizens were almost worthless. But their contribution as a labor force became increasingly important to the war effort. An unresolvable conflict. Economic necessity versus racial fanaticism.
You can even read statements from German experts. Things like, yes, actually, they're so weakened in such terrible health that economically they can't contribute anything anymore. So in reality, it's not at all productive. It bears no relation to economic rationality to use them here as labor.
Gar nicht produktiv und gehorcht gar keiner ökonomischen Rationalität, die jetzt hier als Arbeitskräfte einzusetzen.
Millions of forced laborers struggled to survive. They included many Sinti and Roma. In 1940, film director Leni Riefenstahl began work on a film called Tiefland, Lowlands. She needed extras. The regime provided her with forced laborers from the Marzahn and Max Glan camps.
And then people were needed with dark complexions. For a film set in Spain, people with dark skin and dark hair. And for this, the Sinti were summoned from the camp in Marzahn. Older people, young people, children, they were freely available.
Und die standen ihnen dann frei zur Verfügung.
And there you can see my great-grandmother with her sisters. I've seen this film several times and watched some of the sequences repeatedly. And I see some people who were laughing. For them it was okay at that particular moment. They played along. And I also saw sad faces with thoughtful expressions. I mean, the people were brought from the camps. They were taken there on lorries, and the police were there guarding them.
Und hat die Menschen bewacht.
Of course, when filming finished, they were taken back to either Marzahn or Max Glan. And then in the spring of 1943, they were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and hardly any of them survived. In the film, Riefenstahl plays a kind of saint. She played the part of a Sintitza who dances and helps the weak in society, the farmers. And she couldn't care less what happened to the people who were forced to work on the set. She lived in her own world, and she wanted to further her career. She had her ideas and she turned them into reality, without any concern for the price that was paid. And that was very selfish and, if I may say so, very evil.
Naja, böse, ich sag's mal so.
Under the National Socialist regime, 13 million people were forced to work in Germany. The Germans soon got used to their presence.
Yes, it was normal. That was what made this society so abnormal, that this was normal. Yes, and there was no place for an awareness of injustice. And certainly there was no chance for it to develop. It was just the way things were.
A world turned on its head. The Nazis presented the attack on the Soviet Union as a protective measure, that Germany was defending Europe against the onslaught of Bolshevism, and they hoped to receive support.
Es sind nun, nach unserer deutschen Überzeugung, die Rollen für den Wiederaufbau Europas klar verteilt. Deutschland muss kämpfen und Blut opfern, und wir erwarten von den übrigen Völkern Europas, dass sie uns endlich verstehen und uns durch Arbeit helfen.
According to the Nazi logic, there was one Herrenvolk, or master race, the Germans, and the working races, above all the Slavs, who had to work for the Germans.
War in the Crimea. In the course of their advance, the Germans killed almost the entire Jewish population. Behind the front, the Eastern Economic Administration ruled, an army of bureaucrats that organized the exploitation of the occupied territories. The natural resources of the Crimean Peninsula were divided up among German companies.
This policy of plunder characterized the entire occupation by the Wehrmacht, from individual privates through to entire corporations. To put it crudely, everyone took what they could get.
Paul Schätz and Helmut Wagner from the Hamburg-based tobacco company Remtsma participated in the looting of Crimea, seizing the tobacco stocks they found there. In the first few months, nearly 1,000 tons of tobacco were used to make 1 billion cigarettes. The German occupiers forced civilians to work for them, many directly in the occupied territories. Ruined factories were rebuilt. The Remtsma Group could then continue production in Ukraine.
They could import cheap tobacco and profit from it. And of course, the amount they paid for the workers was minimal. No one was actually paid. All they got was payment in kind. And everything that happened under the Wehrmacht, and everything that was exploited by the German companies, the whole lot was in breach of international law. That's beyond doubt.
Wherever the Wehrmacht conquered new territory, the German economy benefited.
When you occupy a territory, you always seize its raw materials. And that aside, everything was geared towards expansion. Every enterprise aims at expansion, and the National Socialist regime was no exception.
In Crimea, more than 28,000 people, including many children, worked for the German tobacco industry. Like everywhere in the occupied territories, work was mandatory, and there was hunger and cruel treatment of the population.
This was a predatory war, and it was a war of destruction, in which parts of the population were deliberately exposed to starvation. Naturally, none of these companies initiated any measures at all to improve conditions in their area of work. None of them even thought of doing so. They profited from a regime of terror and wretched suffering.
In the occupied territories and in Germany itself, forced laborers were used almost everywhere. In small trade and craft businesses, in churches and local communities, in public services and administration, universities, private households, large corporations in the armaments, automobile and engineering industries, banks and insurance companies, chemical and pharmaceutical companies, construction companies. Nearly everyone in Hitler's Reich profited from the Nazis' forced labor system. From the autumn of 1941, one campaign that had begun with the assault on the Soviet Union was now being systematically organized: the mass murder of European Jews. In early 1942, at the Wannsee Conference at a lake near Berlin, the administration made the worst crime of the century official policy. The Jews were only able to escape the Holocaust, if at all, by working as forced laborers. As here in Dresden, where they were made to work for Zeiss Ikon before being murdered. As part of the so-called final solution, Jews were shot or gassed in their millions, or, in the literal sense of the word, they were forced to work themselves to death.
The Vernichtung durch Arbeit is a German idea that Jews see and they interpret. They say, hey, here or there they're killing people through work. But there, the idea was, let's squeeze them like a lemon. Let's get all the juice out of them. Let's get all the labor out of them. When they're done, we'll discard them.
There was no longer any place for Jewish life. Not in Europe, and certainly not in Germany. Margot Friedländer. At the start of 1943, she was 21 years old. She lived in Berlin with her mother and younger brother, Ralph.
When she was 18, my mother opened a shop here in Berlin. She made buttons covered in fabric. My father fought in the First World War and was awarded the Iron Cross. He always used to say, "They don't mean us. I'm German."
In 1943, the last Jews remaining in Berlin were deported. The Friedländer family had tried to emigrate several times, but their efforts were in vain.
I was walking down Skalitzer Straße at midday when a man ran in front of me. He seemed to be behaving strangely. He went into the building and I followed him. And then I saw that he was standing in front of our door. I was wearing a star, and I took my handbag and held it in front of me, like this. I walked past him to our neighbor's apartment. They let me in and said, "Your mother was here, and she left a message for you." What she wrote was, "Try and make something of your life. I'm leaving with Ralph, wherever they're taking us."
Margot's mother and brother were taken to Auschwitz. The Auschwitz III camp, Monowitz, was next to the Birkenau extermination camp. Here, Jews were made to work for IG Farben, a conglomerate of 8 German companies, These included Bayer, Höchst, BASF, and Agfa.
Perhaps she thought that they'd arrive there. My brother would work. She would make a soup for him in the evenings and be together with him. Could she have imagined that she would get out of the train and that my brother would be told to go right and she left? It's documented that my mother was not given a number, that she was taken straight to the gas chamber. My brother's death is documented too. He survived for about a month. I have often been asked whether I cried. I didn't. I went out and wondered where on earth I would go that night, where I would sleep. The only people I knew were Jews.
Margot Friedländer found a place to hide and dyed her hair. To alter her supposedly Jewish appearance, she had cosmetic surgery on her nose.
I told the man where I was hiding that I didn't feel safe on the streets. You were afraid if you looked Jewish. I had a much nicer looking nose than the one I have now. And he said, "There's a solution. There are operations that can be done." He arranged it for me.
After several weeks living underground, Margot Friedländer was discovered and deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp. Theresienstadt was a stop on the way to the gas chambers in the east. Nazi propaganda falsely described the camp as a ghetto for elderly and well-known Jews, and as a so-called model Jewish settlement.
Wenn der Arbeitstag endet und der Feierabend beginnt, strömen aus den verschiedenen Vorwerken und Arbeitsbaracken die Arbeiter und Arbeiterinnen wieder in die Stadt zurück.
People died like flies, especially the old people. They starved. It was terrible.
Work was often the only means left of survival. Margot Friedländer produced parts for electrical equipment that was important for the war effort. It was delicate work, and it probably saved her life.
One day, I arrived late at the factory because I had overslept. They summoned me, and they told me, after a rather unpleasant conversation, if you weren't such a good worker, you'd be on the next train to the east. But I managed to survive. I was able to remain because I was very good at what I did. That was my great stroke of luck.
At that time, work was also an opportunity to at least survive for a while. The two concepts of destruction through work and salvation through work, which are so evident among the Jewish forced laborers at that time, sometimes overlapped and mixed.
It's a tragic irony built in that in 1942 or 1943, the remnant Jews, if they believe in this policy, what they see is, what is my way to survive? By insinuating myself into the enemy's economy, which strengthens the enemy, the same enemy who is determined to murder me. So my way to survive is to help the enemy who wants to murder me. But there's no way out of that dilemma.
In 1944, a quarter of all work in Germany was performed by forced laborers. In agriculture, the figure was as high as 50%. One of the workers was Marianna Janczak from Poland. From 1940 onwards, she worked for a German farmer. His daughters, sisters Veronika Horma and Rosa Breu, remember Marianna. Historian Andreas Bialas researched Marianna's story.
My name is Marianna Janczak. I was 16 years old when the Nazis took me away. Then the farmers came. They walked around and looked at us like at a slave market. One of the farmers looked at me from head to foot. He asked me with his hands whether I could milk. I nodded yes, and he took me with him.
Who was the farmer?
Our father. Yes.
What did you think about it at the time? There were forced laborers. Did you see the difference? Were they different people or worse people?
They were the same.
They were the same.
Marianna was like a sister.
In the evening, when I went to bed, I cried. I cried out of longing for my homeland, my parents, siblings, my family and my friends. I cried so much that you could have paved the whole road from Bavaria back to Poland with my tears.
Did she say that?
She said that. And that was the scene I remember. It was quiet for at least a minute.
Marianna Janczak was 16 when she was taken away. For 5 years, this tiny room was her home.
My farmer was good to me. He never swore at me or treated me badly.
The police have difficulties persuading farmers that they should eat separately from their Polish workers, that they shouldn't have contact with their Polish workers. There are Catholics who feel that these are fellow Catholics. So although it is true that the whole system of forced labour was carried and, in general, sustained by a very large proportion of the German population, one shouldn't forget those who protested against it, who showed solidarity with foreign workers.
Marianna Janczak fell in love with a Polish forced laborer from the neighboring farm. Romantic relationships between forced laborers were not tolerated, and certainly not if the woman fell pregnant and was potentially unable to continue working.
My Yashko was arrested immediately, interrogated for 2 days and threatened with deportation to a concentration camp. But his farmer got him out again.
Wasn't that Miss Tattenberger?
Yes.
Even though I was pregnant, I had to continue working just as hard.
Winter 1942-43. The anticipated quick victory over the Soviet Union had long since become a war of attrition that devoured all the available resources. The defeats suffered by the Wehrmacht led to a dramatic change on the German labor market. Men were called up in ever greater numbers. They fought on the front lines and died or were taken prisoner. As they withdrew, the Germans left nothing but scorched earth behind them. Anything that couldn't be taken was destroyed. Anyone who was not taken away for forced labor could be executed at any time.
Then all the barriers fell. Inside the Reich too, the measures became increasingly radical. That was clear in the way the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners was systematically extended. By the end, there was nearly 1,000 main and ancillary concentration camps throughout the Reich. By then, only a few islands of civilian life remained unaffected by the concentration camp system. It permeated further and further into German society.
In Nazi Germany's total war, defeat appeared more certain with every day that passed. For many, the only thing that mattered now was survival. The same was true for the millions of forced laborers. In September 1944, the Nazi Labour administration recorded the highest number of foreign workers. Now there were nearly 8 million forced labourers in the Reich. More than a third of them were in the agricultural sector, while the majority were employed in industry. Nearly all of them struggled to survive. The same applied to those who were set to work on strategic construction projects. Germany made every effort to fend off defeat, and in the process, the lives of forced laborers were of no consequence.
In 1944, my father was transferred to Buchenwald concentration camp as a prisoner capable of working. There he was made to work in the stone quarry. The prisoners died like flies.
From 1943 onwards, forced laborers who were unable to work were no longer sent back home. They died at their place of work or in the camps or were murdered. The death rate was highest on the large-scale construction projects, like this submarine bunker in Bremen.
This construction site was ultimately a mirror of the entire National Socialist forced labor system. There were civilian forced laborers and forced laborers from throughout Europe. There were concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and a local camp known as a work education camp run by the Bremen Gestapo. So to this extent, it really was a kind of camp cosmos, a reflection of the system as a whole.
The Valentin U-boat bunker near Bremen. A bomb-proof shipyard was to be built here. It was designed to produce a submarine every 2 days and was to be built in less than 2 years. That was the plan. To this end, over 9,000 forced laborers worked day and night in 10-hour shifts, right in front of the eyes of the citizens of Bremen. The Navy's construction director, Hans-Joachim Steig, commissioned a film to document the work. While there are images of forced laborers, there is no footage of the horror that prevailed here. No violence, no death, no physical punishment, no starvation.
We must be clear that this film was shot in the summer after a new labor unit had just arrived from Neuengamme. Records show that after just a short period, most prisoners weighed only 45 or 50 kilos. We must be clear that they had to drag sacks of cement that may well have been heavier than they were. And here too, there was the phenomenon of the so-called Muselmen. That was the name given by the prisoners to people who were so malnourished that their bodies began to feed on the body's own protein. It turned these people's skin waxy.
Forced labor, hunger, and the cruel principle of providing food on the basis of performance. Those who worked well received slightly more to eat, food that was taken from the bad workers' rations. This amounted to a virtual death sentence for anyone who was sick.
It's like squeezing a sponge until there's nothing left in it, and then throw the sponge away.
They were used as laborers, and when they were no longer able to work, they simply died.
The Roma family farm. Marianne Janczak, the forced laborer, was due to give birth to her baby.
One Sunday in church, the priest announced to all the farmers that if a forced laborer became pregnant, she must immediately report to the children's home in Burgkirchen and give birth there. The whole area was fenced in and guarded.
From 1943 onwards, pregnant forced laborers from Poland and the Soviet Union were no longer allowed to return home.
In most cases, children were taken away from their mothers and brought to so-called foster homes for foreign children. This was a highly euphemistic, sanitized term for a death camp for babies. The babies and infants weren't properly looked after there and were allowed to starve.
It was a systematic neglect. It wasn't accidental that the children died, it was deliberate, essentially. They weren't given enough to eat, they were not properly looked after, their mothers were not allowed to look after them properly. And so they died in very large numbers.
Another woman from Poland told me, "Mariana, there's no one here right now. Come on, I'll show you the babies." And she opened a door, and there they lay, wound up in dirty rags, half naked, some of them covered in sores, lying next to each other on a wooden cot. Then an evil German came out of an office, took hold of the dead children wherever he could, by their feet or by their hands, and threw them onto a truck. I was so afraid for my baby.
This was a mass phenomenon, a crime of which the German public still remains entirely unaware. We assume that between 50,000 and 100,000 babies and infants born to Polish and Soviet forced laborers died in German custody between 1943 and 1945.
In deutschem Gewahrsam zwischen 1943 und 1945 ums Leben gekommen sind.
The Valentin bunker. During its construction, around 1,600 people died, an average of over 2 deaths per day, until 1945.
The story of the end of this construction site is the real story of the bunker. It explains a great deal. The start of construction in 1943 was detected by the Allies. They monitored the work extremely closely for 2 years, and the moment they realized that the final work was being done on the roof, they carried out one air raid.
Specially equipped British bombers hit the Valentin bunker twice. The damage was so great that construction work was stopped.
They could have destroyed the bunker from day one. They could have attacked continuously, but they didn't, because construction was using up German resources and it wasn't doing any harm. And then it was destroyed in one raid, with a snap of their fingers.
The time came for Mariana Janczak to give birth. The day before the baby was due, she fled from the maternity home and returned to the farm.
On May the 9th, my Christina was born, the very same day the war ended. That day I was so happy and proud that I now had a family of my own. On August the 18th, 1945, I was finally allowed to marry the love of my life, Jan, in the little chapel in Altötting, and my happiness was complete. Shortly afterwards, we finally returned home to my beloved Poland after 5 years of slave labor.
Mariana Janczak had 4 children and 8 grandchildren. She died in 2018. Hamburg. Jan Philipp Reemtsma has nothing more to do with the company that bears his name. 40 years ago, he sold his shares in the Reemtsma Tobacco Company, which had exploited forced laborers in Ukraine.
A company isn't guilty. Only people are guilty in the moral or criminal sense. While guilt isn't inherited over generations, a certain degree of responsibility is.
When Jan Philipp Reemtsma learned about the forced laborers at the end of the 1990s, he commissioned a historian to discover the whereabouts of those affected or of their relatives. He paid them compensation from his own personal fortune.
Das ist spät gewesen.
It was late. Not too late, in that there were still survivors. But I could have done something earlier if I had known earlier. I could be accused of waiting too long. Yes, that's true.
Ja, kann man sagen.
Margot Friedländer. Born in Berlin in 1921, she survived the Holocaust and her time as a forced laborer, unlike her parents and her brother. She married Adolf Friedländer in Theresienstadt after the camp was liberated, and in 1946 emigrated with him to the USA, where she worked as a seamstress and a travel agent. Her husband died in 1997. In 2010, Margot Friedländer returned to Berlin to live.
Why did I come back? Because Germans helped me. Because I survived. Because I am a Berliner. Because I love Berlin. Because I have the feeling that I have something to give you.
During the Nazi period, Otto Rosenberg lost his 11 siblings and his grandmother. He himself survived Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dora, and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. His daughter Petra runs a regional Sinti and Roma organization. His second daughter, Mariana Rosenberg, became a famous singer.
They say that she sings cheerful songs, pretty songs. That's true. But if you know her, if you've grown up with her, then you can also hear, how should I put it, that sometimes there is suffering in her voice. That's the suffering that my father passed on to us.